Since I moved in here, this corner of the room has been kind of a dead zone. Just a lot of random stuff, not much functional going on. So my goal for today is to clean it out and start building the bones of whatever's gonna go there. I don't have an exact plan, but my rough idea to start is making some place for these sewing machines to live. They've kind of just been chilling on the floor without a place to make themselves useful. The plants also are going to need a place to live instead of just being shoved in the corner that gets the most sunlight. These old drawers are pretty cool, but not for the studio. They'll be somewhere else in the house. I feel like drawers in the studio just end up inviting clutter. Another thing I'm thinking about in this corner is a bed. I usually sleep on a roll-out mat on the floor, so a dedicated place would be nice. My idea is to kind of separate off a nook in this corner of the room by adding a standing desk for all the sewing machines that kind of juts out from the wall. I want that sewing desk to be roughly 5 foot by 18 inches, which cutting out of a 4x8 leaves me with a 2.5 foot offcut for the bed. That sounds a bit small, but I can always add some later. I'm using the 4x8 I found on the side of the road the other day. It's pretty heavily warped up in this region, but luckily for me that corresponds roughly to the 5 foot by 18 inch section I need to cut out for my surface. I figure if I'm cutting along the lines of the warp, each of my final pieces should be mostly straight. These are getting screwed down to a 2x4 frame anyway, so they should be flat at the end of the day. I cut the 2.5 foot offcut down to 7'3". That is the total length of the gap I'm filling in the corner of the room. I don't know if this will actually end up being a bed for me, but if it is, I want as much length as possible. I'm running this whole thing with no plan, just making decisions as I go. For building out a physical space, I find it easier to just rough out the build and make adjustments rather than make sketches and try to imagine what it might look like. But doing this experimental build process does have its drawbacks as well. My first mistake that cost me some time was messing around with wood stain. I was reaching the end of this can and for some reason had the bright idea to try to thin it out with isopropyl alcohol instead of mineral spirits because I didn't have any. I knew this wasn't correct, but I figured, how wrong could it go? Turns out instead of thinning it, it just kind of congealed the grainy bits at the bottom, which the roller just carried out and ended up putting a very thick dose on this board. I didn't know yet, but that would cost me quite a bit of time later on. Anyway, for the framing of the desk and the bed frame, I needed some 2x4s. I had this giant pallet laying around. It was about 10 feet long, covered in particle board. I think they used this to ship a roll of carpet or something. But in any case, it had 4 10-foot 2x4s in it, which I desperately needed right now. My supply is running low. So I just needed to pry it apart for a good while, taking out all the staples and nails that held it together. At the end of the day, I'm not sure if things like this are worth my time. You know, this maybe was a total of $20 of lumber at the most, but I have a hard time turning these things down when I see them, and saving $20 is saving $20. Maybe I would have passed though if I knew how long it would have taken to pry all these little pieces apart. They were nailed together on each side with like 6 nails. But I got it done and I had 10 not so nice 2x4s, but they were straight. It was kind of a shame to cut these down because I don't come across super long scrap wood that often. But I did what I had to do. I don't have many 2x4s over 2 or 3 feet right now. I cracked open a new old can of stain that ended up drying a lot better than the other one did. And with that, I had all my pieces for the basic frames and tops of my 2 surfaces. After letting those dry for a bit, I brought in the bigger set of boards for my little prison bed frame. This construction went together just how I expected, easy 2x4 framing. No warps in the frame, and the warp on the surface came out just fine. I stuck on some 8-inch 4x4s as little temporary feet for it. I'm not sure what the final mounting of this thing is actually going to look like. I think I want it to fold up against the wall with some kind of hinge mechanism, but for the moment it'll just stay on the ground. Iterative design, gotta start somewhere. Now, the main event for today. The little 5-foot standing desk did not come together so easily. The surface ended up not drying at all. I had to hit it hard with 40 grit to get it to come down. And then the 2x4s I chose for this one ended up being extremely warped. I literally had no other long 2x4s in my collection, so I had to splice together a bunch of shorter ones. It was like 10 p.m. at this point, so all the hardware stores were closed too. This is where I realized my ambition had gotten the better of me and that this was not a one-day project. I also had friends in town, so there was no chance this was getting done. On the plus side, the 2x4 splicing ended up working. It was actually very straight. But when I stuck test fit legs on it and stood it up, I realized I had another issue. I could not put this thing right up against the wall like I planned because there's a chimney that juts out about 6 inches over there. So I made some marks, took the temporary legs off to get it outside, and the next morning I started chopping the corner of my table off. You see what I mean about the occasional downsides of building without a plan? This is how you're supposed to use a square, right? Anyway, at this point I was feeling pretty good again. I'd created some problems for myself yesterday. Warped boards, wood stain that didn't sink in, all stuff I could have avoided. But now I was on the path to making corrections, fixing stuff, and coming out with a functional piece. I kinda like this two-tone look, the dark stain and the white new boards. It's a visual representation of each part of this that did not go to plan. I could stain it all dark and make it look more cohesive, but I don't think I will. It's a reminder to not get too overambitious. To remember that it's okay to go into things without a plan, but not to feel guilty when it ends up taking longer than expected. It's hard to schedule a creative process that is inherently spontaneous, and that's okay as long as you can manage your expectations of yourself. That's one thing I'm trying to get better at. With my table now looking nice and sturdy, or more ugly and sturdy, I could put my sewing machines on it. This one is an old beast. This thing very badly needs remounting. I stuck it on an old stool. I think this was literally the first woodworking project I ever did. All I had was these 1x4s, so I sandwiched them together and stuck some machine screws through it. This stitcher is a cobbler sewing machine for leather primarily. It's a hand crank, so having a big ol' sturdy base is pretty important for it. To get it mounted really well, my plan is to use screws and T-nuts. Unfortunately, sizing this thing up, I discovered the screws I bought are actually bigger than the holes in this machine. Luckily, this thing has a cheap Chinese cast iron frame, so it was actually incredibly easy to drill through. With most metals, relatively slow and not too much pressure is the name of the game. T-nuts are one of my favorite things for hard mounting tools. I would use them for literally everything if they didn't cost like $2 each. My alignment was pretty tight here, so I ended up pushing the bolt through, threading it on by hand, setting it in with the bolt started, and then pulling the T-nut all the way in by just torquing down the bolt. Very nice. I love these things. Feels very sturdy, way better than the one that I made when I was like 18. I ended up chopping it down a little more to buy myself some more space for the regular sewing machine next to it. And yes, I do realize kicking up sawdust around sewing machines is not a great idea, but honestly all these need a deep clean and re-grease anyway. They've been in storage for so long. I hard mounted that leather sewing machine to the table, and with that I've got a little standing desk for my sewing machines. The hand crank leather sewing machine could use a little shelf for accessories, needles, leather working threads, and scraps. Eventually I'd like to set the home fabric sewing machine into the table, giving it more effective working surface. And the third machine is a computerized embroidery machine that I just picked up to do custom hats. In another video I'm going to make a whole custom jig to clamp the hats down correctly every time. The bed frame is not done. That's gonna get hinged up and it'll fold against the wall. But this whole corner's just getting started. This is just the skeleton of what's going to be here. The plan for this little nook of the room involves a lot more building. There's this desk for the 3 main sewing machines, but there's also gonna be another desk that this bed folds up under. That's gonna have 3D printers and the injection molding machine on it. Then a second layer of shelves over this thing. I want all my plants up there because they need good spots where they get sunlight from the window. So I'm thinking like right about here, put all the plants up there, and then that gives me a nice little separation from this area of the room. I don't know, I wasn't sure about dividing up the room like this by having this jut out, But even though it's 5 feet long, because of this shelf, it only really comes out maybe 3.5 feet into the room. So it doesn't really make the room feel smaller like I thought it would, and it makes my editing station kind of more cozy and introduces this little area. I like it. Lots to do still for sure, but for the moment, I'm happy with this. I learned a good lesson about ambition, what is and isn't a one-day project. I'm learning something new every day with these more frequent uploads. Tomorrow might be a stream instead of a fully produced video, but who knows, maybe I'll put out a little 4 or 5 minute small project. We'll see. But in any case, in some way, some format, I will see you tomorrow. Thank you for your time.